Shabbat Shalom and welcome to Sighted Moon newsletter for July 17th, 2020. Now I'm playing catch up because I missed this one last week. So I'm trying to do this catching up. This is the 21st newsletter for the year 5856. It is the 20th day of the 5th month. So it says here July 18, 2020. Shabbat Shalom to the royal family of Yehovah. The website. James has told me that all the bugs are fixed on the website. If you have any problems with anything that you're trying to find, then please do send us a detailed explanation of what you were trying to do and what happened. I will forward everything to James to fix. Please let us know so that we can make any corrections as quickly as possible. The new moon of the 6th month. The new moon should be visible this coming Monday evening. So Monday evening was in fact the new moon, and we had two witnesses. I believe Rebecca was one, and then a second witness from, I think it was the Israeli New Moon Society, if I'm not mistaken. Take your family out and look for it. At the same time, look for the comet. The comet will be above or near the Big Dipper. Take the whole family out and search for both. Let us know when you see it. I looked on that day on Monday. I didn't see anything. However, I think I did see something on Tuesday, the new moon, I should say. Skip over this. The comet, is this a bad omen? Okay. We have been listing in the past newsletters events that have happened near the dates we believed would mark the start of the 2300 days of hell. So the pandemic, again, was on Passover, the day we kept Passover in 2020. And then the UN warning of famine. This was said the week of Shavuot. The same week, they started closing food processing plants. Then 6 days before the May 31st Shavuot date, the day we have been speaking about since 2005, the day we thought was going to be the start of the 2300 days of hell, George Floyd was killed, setting off the riots and looting and BLM protests around the world, and the call to defund all police. As of today, July 11th, these protests persist and riots. We told you about the lunar eclipse of June the 4th and the solar eclipse of June 21. And the next one, July 5th, that's already passed. Last week, we listed all the news events that took place on these days. We also told you of the conjunction of the moon with Mars in the constellation Cetus on 3 different occasions. We also have had 2 interviews with Cyrus Harding as he explained the crazy cycles of perigee and apogee of the orbit of the moon around the Earth. I listened to both interviews. They're very interesting and thought-provoking. I went out Sunday morning at 4 a.m. to look at this comet. I could also see the moon and Mars in the tail of the constellation Cetus. You can see many pictures of the comet starting from July the 5th at this link. The event is once in a lifetime. It takes 6,800 years to complete its path around the sun, according to NASA. Starting this weekend, it will be visible to viewers in the northern hemisphere in the evening after sunset. This comet was not expected or known before this past week. So let's recap some of the signs in the heavens we've been telling you about. And it's ironic because this is what Jesus Christ, Yeshua, spoke about in Luke 21, Matthew 24, these terrible, or better expressed as amazing signs in the heavens that will come to pass in the beginning of the birth pang. So July 10, Venus at Aphelion, July 11th, Venus of Aldebaran, July 11th, Mars of the moon. When I looked at Mars, it was in conjunction with the moon. My heart stopped. On July 11th, the moon represents Israel in the tale of Zeus, the great Leviathan, the bound serpent spoken of in the Bible. Mars in Hebrew is called Adam and means bloodshedding. So you can see that picture there. The two fish are bound to the serpent by the cords. This serpent is the second deacon of the constellation of Aries. Actually, just thinking out loud now, maybe a lot of Revelation is talking about constellations, but we're looking for literal fulfillments of, dragons and virgins and things like that, when it could just very well be revealed to us in the stars, ironically enough. Other depictions have the lamb Aries holding two ribbons. The fish on the right represents Judah, and the one going north represents Israel. So you can see the phases, phase 6, July 26 to August 18, and it increases, or the intensity is at 30%. With the moon at apogee, look where the moon and Mars end up. In the ribbon for Judah, okay, Judah is the moon, right? Does this mean anything? We will only know after that date passes. Then I went another month and looked at September the 5th, 2020. I see the moon in conjunction with Mars. Again, only this time Mars is in the ribbon connected to Israel. What does this mean? Again, I don't know. I'm only showing you what I found. Okay, more pictures. This photo is taken by a cosmonaut at the International Space Station. One of the brightest comets in decades is passing Earth. So that's just talking about the comet that's already passed. I'll just skip over that now. I saw it Sunday morning at 4 a.m. On Monday evening, it was then visible after sunset. In July, the comet will be visible in the northwestern sky after sunset near the Big Dipper. You will recall what Cyrus Harding said in our video interview about the next supercycle that is to begin after the feast days. Cyrus told us before that the crazy cycles, when people act weird during the full moon, would become more intense, up to 75% during the week we are currently in. After that, it would wind down until about August the 18th. You can watch that video at this link. He is now saying the next cycle is going to start immediately at 50% intensity to 66.7% about October 18, and go up to an intensity of around 89% by December 14, before dropping back down again to 50% to 67% on February 11th, 2021. Again, he is using the perigee of the moon around the Earth, or how close the moon comes to the Earth in its orbits and reflecting the sun's gamma rays. So perigee is the closeness of the moon to the Earth, whereas I think apogee is when it's farther away. The second video can be watched at this link, and make sure you sign up for our YouTube channel. You will also recall that we shared with you the video of the pastor who had a dream last year that came true, and his most recent dream about the hand underlining the month of September and then November. He then said in his dream, this hand then smashes the month of November and it flies apart. I also told you my views about those who have dreams, how you can't verify them. But for some reason, this dream has caught a lot of people's attention. Now this past week, we had a comet that showed up. It was not expected. What does it mean? Does it have any meaning at all? Comets are often seen as a bad omen, appearing years before a major war or natural disaster. A few examples of this was the comet seen before the Exodus, the first Passover, and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. In natural history, Pliny wrote that it was a terrible comet that was twisted like a coil, and it was very grim to behold. Exodus 9:19 records, so there was hail and fire, mingled with the hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in all the land of Egypt, since it became a nation. The Talmud records stones fell in Egypt and were very hot. Josephus wrote about a heavenly appearance resembling a sword in the sky before the destruction of the temple. October 2011, Astronomy magazine carried an interesting article on comets. The first paragraph reads like this: this makes them an object of popular fascination and has led to their common association as omens of significant events on Earth. The destruction of Jerusalem by Roman Emperor Titus and the Norman conquest of England are two famous examples. Please remember, astronomy is a science, but astrology is witchcraft. God many times will use a comet as a sign of upcoming events. In Job 38, there's a mention about hail. In March 44 BC, a group of Roman senators assassinated Julius Caesar over concerns he would declare himself king. 4 months later, a huge funerary festival called Ludi Victoriae Caesarius was held in his honor. A great comet appeared in the skies during the ceremony and remained visible for 7 days before disappearing. Today we remember that comet as the Great Comet of 44 BC. Astronomers say it is one of the brightest comets to have ever appeared in the sky, and it was also recorded in ancient China. The Romans did not consider the appearance of the comet a coincidence. They claimed it was actually the soul of Julius Caesar as he left the earth to become a god in the skies. But fortunately, it is unlikely we'll ever see the comet again. The earth sped up as it flew past and sent it out of our solar system. October 14, 1066. Troops loyal to King Harold of England faced the Norman army led by William the Conqueror in the Battle of Hastings. The battle was decisive. King Harold was killed, and William the Conqueror went on to take his throne and become the ruler of England. Halley's Comet, which appeared on April of that year, was linked to the battle. As we mentioned, people of that day had not realized that the comet was a periodic one that would come around every 3/4 of a century. That year, Halley's Comet was so bright that it was 4 times the size of Venus and around 25% as bright as the moon. Astrologers in England suggested that the comet had something to do with an upcoming battle with the Normans. However, they could not determine if it was a good or a bad omen. They discovered it was a bad omen when King Harold was killed. However, what was bad for King Harold was good for William the Conqueror, who had also spotted the comet in France while traveling to England for the battle. He called it a wonderful sign from heaven and suggested it was evidence that he would win the war. He was right. Another great comet soared past the Earth in 1264. Today we call it C-1264N1, or the Great Comet of 1264. It was very bright and remained visible for 4 months, starting in July. At the time, people already had some superstitions about comets, and Seeing one was considered a forewarning of impending disaster. This time it was the death of Pope Urban IV, who is said to have become ill immediately after the comet was sighted that July. He died in October 1264, reportedly on the last day that the comet was visible. On October 10th, 1811, Europeans and Americans watched in awe as a bright comet made its closest approach to the Earth. This was the Great Comet of 1811. The comet had showed up in March, even though no one was expecting to see one at the time. Some Americans became paranoid and suggested that it was an omen of some upcoming disaster. Well, that disaster came on December 16, when a great earthquake shook the Midwest and southern United States. The earthquake was so intense that the Mississippi River temporarily flowed backwards. Americans soon linked the comet with the earthquake. They blamed it again when the US and England went to war the following year. Americans weren't the only ones to blame a random comet for causing a disaster. Napoleon Bonaparte cited the comet in Europe too. He considered it a good sign and evidence that he would be victorious in his planned invasion of Russia. Napoleon later realized that the comet was a bad omen after he suffered defeat at the hands of the Russians. Until the 16th century, comets were usually considered bad omens of death of kings or noblemen, or coming catastrophes. Ancient Chinese made important decisions by looking at celestial omens and comets. And comets were an important omen, always disastrous. Under the theory of Wu Xing, also known as 5 elements, comets were thought to signify an imbalance of yin and yang. Chinese emperors employed observers specifically to watch for them. Some important decisions were made as a result. For instance, Emperor Ruizong of Tang abdicated after a comet appearance in 712 AD. Comets were thought to have military significance. For example, the breakup of a comet on 35 AD was interpreted as portending the destruction of Gongsun Shu by Wu Han. Why am I bringing up this comet in 2020? Yes, it comes in a year and at a time of great volatility. It also comes preceding the horrific events I have been warning you were to begin in 2020 and last until the destruction of Satan in 2033. Has Yehovah used comets in the past as warnings? Let me share with you a story about 2 comets that drew our attention to them. The first came in the sabbatical year of 2016, the second the year after. We are opening this month with a look at the deacon Perseus, in the Hebrew meaning the breaker, as one who makes a breach. On June 15, 2016, Mars aligned with Beta Perseus, Algol, the star associated with the head of the adversary. This indicates Mars, Michael the warrior archangel, in conflict with the adversary. From the picture of this deacon, we can see how this conflict turns out in the severed head of the enemy. We find this Hebrew word for breaker used in Micah chapter 2, verses 12 to 13. The Hebrew name for the constellation Perseus is Peretz, also meaning the breaker, representing Jesus Christ as he defeats the beast in Revelation 20, delivering his captive bride, as seen in the constellation Andromeda. The language in Micah 2:12 above certainly agrees with this idea of gathering the captive bride of Israel together in the Lord's second coming. The beta star Algol, is located in the severed head of Satan, held by Perseus among the stars of the northern Milky Way, a deacon of Aries. It's positioned west of the brightest star in Capella Alpha Aurigae and southeast of the well-known W of Cassiopeia. As Bullinger tells us, the star A, Alpha in the waist, called Mirfak, who helps. The next star Y in the right shoulder is named Al-Ghanib, which means who carries away. The bright star in the left foot is called Athik, who breaks, depicted in figure 1 below. Figure 1, Perseus delivering his captive bride Andromeda. In his left hand he carries a severed head, which by perversion the Greeks called the head of Medusa, being ignorant that its Hebrew root meant the trodden underfoot. It is also called Rosh Satan, the head of the adversary. Interesting. And Al-One, Arabic, the subdued, or Al-Ghul, the evil spirit. This bright star in the head, named Al-Ghul, or Ghul, means rolling around. It is a most remarkable phenomenon that so many of these enemies should be characterized by variable stars. But this head of Medusa, like the neck of Cetus, has one of the best known variables. Al-Ghul is continually changing. In about 69 hours, it changes from the 4th magnitude to the 2nd. This first known variable star represents this transitive nature of the enemy who, like a roaring lion, is seeking whom he may devour, then changing into an angel of light. The adversary is always transforming himself as a subtle serpent to steal, kill, deceive, and destroy. Algol is a bright eclipsing binary system in the northern Deccan of Perseus. As one of the best known variable stars in the sky normally, it's at magnitude plus 2.1, but every 2 days, 20 hours and 49 minutes, the star suddenly dips in brightness to remaining dim for about 10 hours before returning to its original state. The change in brightness results in the Algol system pictured below, consisting of at least 3 stars. Okay, I'm going to just skip over this section here. It's kind of very technical. Okay, just look over. It says here, on January 22, 2008, it was in very close conjunction, so let's talk about Comet Holmes that passed through Perseus, October 25, 2007 to January 20, 2008. And that's significant because actually that's when President Obama was inaugurated, if I'm not mistaken. The 20th there. In Perseus's left hand, okay. The main star in Rosh Satan, the head of Satan. Here the arc of the path of Comet Holmes appears to depict the path of the sword of the breaker as it cut off Satan's head. Since comets signify disaster, these comet signs linked with Perseus would depict the imminent, disastrous, and final destruction of the adversary at the hands of the Lord. Comet Holmes was discovered by Edwin Holmes in 1892. It had a similar outburst to the one in 2007. Okay, the comet was magnitude 4 to 5 and faded from visibility over several weeks. The orbital period was 6.9 years, and then it was observed again in 1899 and 1906. After that, it was lost for 58 years, or 8 comet cycles. It was rediscovered in 1964 and has been observed on every return since. The comet exhibited normal behavior until October 23, 2007. Between October 23 to 24, the comet brightened from magnitude 17 to almost magnitude 2 in only a few hours. This extreme outburst has no precedent except 1892. This idea that a comet depicted events shown in the star picture Perseus is not an isolated incident, nor the first time that notable comet activity has been linked to Algol. In 1996 and 1997, two bright comets made unique appearances in Perseus. These were comets Hyakutake and Hale-Bopp. They appeared in the same place in Perseus 1 year apart on the same day, April 11, 96 and 97. The spot where they crossed in Perseus was in his forehead and between the eyes of Rosh Satan, near the star Algol, the exact same place that comet Holmes also targeted 10 years later in 2007, 2008 to sever the head of the enemy. There was a foreshadowing of this event when David destroyed another beast that came up against Israel, namely Goliath. David shot a stone into the forehead of Goliath and then, taking Goliath's sword, cut off the beast's head. Afterwards, David came before Saul holding the head of Goliath in his hand. The comets Hyakutake and Hale-Bopp crossed at the spot where David slung the stone into Goliath's forehead, felling him. Comet Hale-Bopp passed through the deacon Perseus, carrying the enemy's severed head. The comet crossed Algol, the star positioned in the forehead of Satan, on April 11. This noteworthy united testimony with comet Hyakutake that also crossed through the head of Satan at Algol on the 11th of April is a celestial prophecy of the demise of the adversary. Thus, it was no coincidence that these two comets crossing in Satan's forehead, almost right between the eyes, on the same day, April 11th, 1 year apart, marking the beast for destruction. Yeah, it's actually very interesting because I know 1996 is, I believe, the beginning of, especially at this time of the year, in the spring, it's when the year begins. That would be the beginning of the end of the 119th Jubilee cycle. So that's when the 120th Jubilee cycle would start, 96, and that's 49 years. So that's 2044. That's when it would end. The intersection of the two comets' paths near Algol appears like a cross or an X, marks the spot between the eyes or in the forehead of Rosh Satan. The area of the sky in the forehead of Satan, where the comets crossed paths called in Hebrew, where the nearest brightest star is, Algol, has long been known as the most malevolent star in the sky. This mark of the cross on the forehead also points to the mark of the beast in the forehead of his followers. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. Okay, so this is Revelation 19, verses 14 to 20. So people left on the earth during the time of the future tribulation who consent to the rule of the beast or the Antichrist, or the Antichrist, will get this mark of the beast on the right hands or foreheads, even as the Almighty marked the head of Satan with the axe, where the comets crossed. So the beast will mark his rebellious followers, even as the first rebel among men and against God came, was marked by God himself. Perseus and Andromeda in the portrayal of Peretz delivering his captive bride. Okay. We also have a story about a comet that came in 66 AD that led to the destruction of the temple. Josephus explained to Vespasian about an ambiguous oracle that said that a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Now, almost every Jew believed this prophecy referred to the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah. However, who said that the ruler was to rise out of Israel was to be a Jew? Why should Vespasian not become king or emperor? Ridiculous though it might seem to a modern reader, Vespasian was impressed. After all, in Gaul and Hispania, an insurrection had started against Emperor Nero, and it was clear to any intelligent observer that civil war is about to break out. Besides, everyone had observed the comet, resembling a sword, that had stood over the country during the preceding months. Instead of having Joseph crucified, the Roman general kept him in detention. The former, I think they're talking about Josephus, the former Jewish commander became friends with Titus, who was of the same age. Nero committed suicide in June 68. He was succeeded by Galba, who was lynched January 69. Two men tried to become emperor, Vitellius and Otho, both commanding large armies. The latter was defeated, and Vitellius became the new, very unpopular emperor. This was the moment Vespasian had been hoping for, and Joseph's prophecy came true in July 69. Not only was Joseph released, he was also rewarded with the Roman citizenship, with the Roman name Titus Flavius Josephus, with an Egyptian wife, and with a role as advisor of the new crown prince, Titus, who was to end the war. When Titus laid siege to Jerusalem, Flavius Josephus served as his translator. He also had to persuade the defenders of Jerusalem to surrender. Since he was seen as a traitor, his arguments did not convince Jewish leaders like Josephus, his old enemy, John of Giscala. He was also mistrusted by many Romans, who attributed every reverse to some treachery on his part. However, Titus trusted and protected his advisor. The siege lasted almost half a year and ended with the complete destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. I do not use the book of Jasher very often, but it does have some information to keep in mind at this time. The birth of Abraham. In the book of Jasher, there's a certain celestial event mentioned which occurred at the birth of Abraham. The book of Jasher is not a canonical book of the Bible, but is referred to in, actually, I believe it's in 2 Samuel, not Joshua 10. That was inserted in the Masoretic, and the Septuagint actually is not referred to, only in Samuel. The translation that I have in my possession was published by Noah and Gould in 1840. Jasher 8, verse 1-4 reads, "And it was in the night that Abram was born, that all the servants of Terah and all the wise men of Nimrod, and his conjurers came and ate and drank in the house of Terah, and they rejoiced with him on that night. And when all the wise men and conjurers went out from the house of Terah, they lifted up their eyes toward heaven that night to look at the stars, and they saw, and behold, one very large star came from the east and ran in the heavens, and he swallowed up the 4 stars from the 4 sides of the heavens." And all the wise men of the king and his conjurers were astonished at the sight. And the sages understood this matter, and they knew its import. And they said to each other, "This only betokens the child that has been born to terror this night, who will grow up and be fruitful and multiply and possess all the earth, he and his children forever. And he and his seed will slay great kings and inherit their lands." The questions arise: what was the very large star that came from the east and ran in the heavens? What were the four stars from the four sides of the heavens? And what are the four sides of the heavens? With all this history and with all that has happened in 2020, what is predicted to come in Daniel 9 prophecy? Should we be concerned about this comet that is in the north and eastern sky? From a North American view, this is pointing towards Europe. The EU, as we all know, is the great whore that is going to destroy the USA. Psalm 19, verses 1 to 4, and Luke 21, verses 25 and 26. Parasha Chukat. Welcome to Parashat Chukat. This week we learn about Moses' sin of hitting the rock when God told him to speak to it. In past years, we at Aleph Beta have often focused on the event itself. Why did Moses hit the rock? What's the difference between hitting and speaking? Was the sin so bad that Moses deserved to be banned from entering Israel for it? These are real questions, and check the links below for the videos where we discuss them. But there's another aspect of the story that often gets overlooked, and that's what happened right before Moses hit the rock. What precipitated needing to speak to or hit the rock in the first place? You guessed it, it's another complaint. The nation of Israel complained that there is no water. How can we describe the Israelites' relationship with God? Okay, so we see over the past few weeks, they keep complaining, even after everything God has done for them. This week it gets stranger because we've heard the same exact complaints before. They moaned about food and water. They cried about food and numbers. Don't they see each time they cry, God provides for them? Shouldn't they have learned their lesson? If they run out of water, they shouldn't whine, they should pray. God hasn't let them down yet. Do they forget God always takes care of them? After this chutzpah, you would assume God would be angry. Enough, stop complaining. But shockingly, God acquiesces. He tells Moses to supply the people with water, as if their complaining was justified. What's going on? As we explore this story in the Parsha experiment, the key to unlocking this mystery may be in the context of the story. The last week, Korach ended on a somber note. After sinning over and over, Israel finally accepted their fate. They said, look, we're going to die. We're lost. We're all lost. And that's what happened. So that's the last story of the Torah that deals with that generation of Israel, according to most commentators. The next story takes place 40 years later. Now, the people of Israel are new people, Generation B. They weren't the ones who complained like the earlier times. The people who are Generation A struggled with the challenge of being reliant on God. They complained so much. They were scared to give up control, to rely on God completely. They failed, and God decided they won't get to enter the land, the promised land. But now we have a new generation, B, who starts from scratch. They have to learn the lesson their parents never did, that all they have is from God, and they need to trust Him completely. Can they do it? A chance for the Israelites to restore their relationship with God. It seems to start off tragically. In the very first story, featuring Generation B. The people argued with Moses. Moses, why have you taken us out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? Reading this, we're so disappointed. This is exactly how Generation A sinned. It seems like Generation B will replay the sin of their parents, trying to control their own fate and not trusting God to take care of them. But it's not too late for them. Just like God gave Generation A several chances to learn their lesson, God will give Generation B chances. Maybe Generation B will understand what their parents couldn't, that Israel as a people must give up control and put their trust in God. So God doesn't punish them for complaining, Generation B. He uses this moment to provide for them. He instructs Moses to speak to the rock so that it will give them water. And in doing so, nudge the people. Don't worry. I'm here for you. Trust me. I'll take care of you forever. And now we're left hanging. Is it going to work? Will the people learn the lesson their parents never did? The next story gives the answer, or seems to. The Canaanite king of Arad heard Israel was coming. He waged war with Israel, took captive. So the people of Israel are in dire straits. They're in battle with a nation stronger than themselves, and some of their people have already been taken captive. So what are they to do now? Well, they have a precedent to look to. 39 years ago, their parents considered the prospect of fighting the Canaanite nations after the report of the spies. They lost it. They mourned their fate, lost faith in God, complained to Moses and Aaron that they wanted to return to Egypt rather than enter the promised land. Now, their children are faced with an even worse situation. Not a future clash with Canaan. They're already in a battle and they're losing. If Generation B is anything like A, now's the time, the perfect time to lose resolve. Look what happens next. How did the Israelites grow their relationship with God? Israel made a vow with God. They said, if you deliver this nation into our hands, we'll take the spoils of these cities and dedicate them to you. As the commentators explain, this is a groundbreaking moment for Israel. They don't complain. They don't ask to go back to Egypt. They say, God, help us. Come to think of it, who is missing from this narrative? Moses. They don't complain to Moses. They don't blame him. They turn to God. They recognize their failure or their success is dependent on God only. It seems that Generation B succeeded and they learned their lesson, the lesson their parents never did. Look what happens next. God heard Israel's voice and he delivered Canaan into their hands. God listened, took care of them, as he always promised to, as long as they trust him. It really feels like the tides of Bamidbar are turning. Until now, the stories have been disastrous and tragic. Over and again, the people sinned by pushing God out of the picture. Each time they did, they faced the calamitous consequences. But Generation B is figuring it out. The people are coming closer and closer to God. They're making him front and center. In return, God helps them defeat the superior Canaanite army. But then, disaster strikes. The people start traveling again. They speak with God and with Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt? To die in the desert, for we have no bread or water. What? Again? After Generation B recognized God and they got the message, they're back to complaining? How is this possible? Look again at the first line. maybe it's not the same as Generation A. Look at the word. It means to speak, have a conversation. In the past, we've seen different verbs. People complained, they argued, fought. Now it's they spoke. It's different. They're complaining, but it seems to be a lesser form. Something else is different in their complaints. Generation A spoke to Moses and hadn't communicated directly to God. But with Generation B, the people don't turn to Moses. They don't just turn to him. Yeah, they turn to him as their leader, but first and foremost, they turn to God. The trend that started in the battles with Canaan in the last story continued. They're recognizing God and they're communicating with him. So while they properly channeled their issues to God, still they complained. And while they spoke with him, they still did include Moses instead of just God. As a result, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of Israel died. So how do the people respond? Again, they are tested. Will Generation B respond the way the parents did, or will they acknowledge they messed up? Clues on how to revive a relationship with God. Look at what they do. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned. We have spoken against God and against you." And they continue, "Moses, pray to God and have him remove the snakes from us." Generation B did what their parents couldn't. They see that God is in control, but while the people recognized that they sinned, they made the same mistake again. They asked Moses to pray to God for them. They should have cried out to God directly like they did after the war in the very last story. So God does acquiesce to the people, but he doesn't stop the plague or remove the snakes. He tells Moses to do something odd. Make a fiery serpent, place it on a pole or a mace. A mace. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. I just want to add here that I wouldn't say it's a mistake that they called for Moses to be praying on their behalf, because in a lot of ways Moses and Aaron represent Jesus Christ, who is our high priest, who makes intercession for us. We can't come to God the Father without Jesus Christ and without his blood, without accepting it, without being under his blood. We won't be able to. We would be vaporized. We wouldn't have access to the Father at all. So I think it's a mistake this man makes, but might just be coming from a Jewish perspective who possibly does not accept the Messiah. Does that remind you of anything? Anyone who is bitten can look on it and live. Where have we seen something that was raised up by Moses, and through it came national divine protection from an attack? Way back in Exodus, when Generation A was battling with Amalek, Israel was only successful as long as Moses kept his hands raised up to God, as if to say, as long as people recognize their strength, that everything comes from God, they'll actually have their strength. They'll have that strength. Now Generation B experiences the same thing. And I want to also add, does this remind me of anything? Yeah. When you look at the bronze serpent, you will be healed. When you look at Jesus Christ on the cross, his sacrifice heals us from our stripes, like it's prophesied in Isaiah. So I really feel this person does not believe in Jesus Christ. Anyhow, restoring a relationship with God. In this story, they're slowly learning that message that God is their strength, that all that they have is from God. And God caps it all by reinforcing that point. So long as you look up, you recognize your successes and your failures, your sustenance and guidance is all sourced back to me. You'll be fine. I'll take care of you. Parashat Chukat marks a turning point in the history of Israel. Generally, when we read Numbers, we always look at failures. We get caught up with Israel's complaints, with Moses' tragic mistake, but we miss what is perhaps the most beautiful and instructive part of the story. The new generation turns it around. After the snake story, we hear anecdotes about Israel's military success. It's not just historical data. The Torah is highlighting the stark contrast between the past generation and this one. One was punished terribly, the other was successful in all they did. And the difference in fate rested one simple point. This new generation understood what we today are meant to learn as well, that all strength is from God, and that's all God was waiting for. Parashat Balak. So it says here, why was the prophet Balaam hired by Balak? Balaam and Abraham. Balaam, of course, is the star of this week's Parsha. He's the non-Jewish prophet who's hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to try to defend his land against invasion by the Israelites. Actually, Abraham isn't Jewish either. Anyway, Balak doesn't want Balaam to build a Sherman tank or machine guns. He's looking for spiritual protection. He wants Balaam to curse the Jewish people, actually the Israelites more specifically, and somehow allow Balak to get the upper hand against them in the war. Balaam is a spiritual mercenary of sorts, a prophet for hire. But why, of all people, would we think of contrasting Balaam and Abraham? Why would we think of contrasting them the way the Mishnah does? Let us hear what the Mishnah says about these men. So basically it's saying that those who have a generous eye and humble spirit, they're disciples of Abraham, but they're saying those who have a narrow spirit and a haughty disposition are of Balaam. Why are the sages hard on Balaam? He's categorized as Balaam Harasha, the evil one, and yet a quick look of the text doesn't seem to yield great evil in him. He seems like a nice guy. I mean, it's true, he's a prophet for hire. He's willing to harm the Israelites. If Balak ends up being one of his clients, he tells Balak over and over, I'm just going to say what God puts in my mouth. I can't contravene God's word in a great way or a little way. So he never says anything that God doesn't want him to say or doesn't tell him to say. So why are they hard on him, the sages? Why does he deserve to be called Balaam Harasha? These two questions, where does it lurk? Balaam's great evil, and why contrast him to Abraham? It's something I'd like to explore with you in this week's parasha. So I'm just going to scan over it. It seems quite lengthy. Let me just get the highlights. So they share a common thread in the language of I will bless. I know that anyone that you bless, so if you bless someone, they will be blessed. If you curse them, they will be cursed. And then with Abraham, it says, those who curse you will be cursed, and those I will bless those who bless you. So very similar language, not exactly the same, but similar. And then the inverse characteristics of Balaam and Abraham. Let me look over this as well. There's another similarity with the Akedah journey. I'm not sure what Akedah means, but it doesn't really tell us here. The binding of Isaac. Okay, so I guess that's what it means, Akedah. So Abraham hears the words, take your beloved one, your Yakid, I think that's what it is in Hebrew, and give him to me as a sacrifice, essentially. Okay. So they go there. Abraham would do anything not to hear these words, but when God asks you to do something you don't want to do, what is your challenge? Many of us would say, your challenge is, will you do it or not? So at one level, that's of course, it's true, but I think there's a deeper challenge. It's not, will I do it, but will I admit to myself that this is truly what's being asked of me? Will I allow myself to see things as they truly are? Or will I deceive myself about what God has asked of me? So we're going to look at Balak now, but I want to bring up another point that I think that's what happened with Abraham and Sarah, that, yeah, they did understand that God said, I'll give you, a seed, you're going to have a child, but the way they interpreted it, that reality, they deceived themselves of what God asked of them, of what God promised them. They said, oh, you know what? This is what God meant. You go into Hagar, that's the promised child. It's not really me because I can't give birth anymore, but it's Hagar, and that's the child that God meant. But no, God didn't say that. They deceived themselves. They didn't allow themselves to see the truth as it truly was. So this, we're going to look at a closer look at Balaam and Balak's story. Just can't over it. So what they're saying here is that Balaam is showing us that God is withholding himself. Balaam is holding back. So he keeps trying to get him to curse Israel, basically. And let me just read this last section. This seems kind of circular reasoning in this paragraph, so I'm not going to go into that. The next question is, why was God mad at Balaam? There's a principle here. God said, no. Balaam comes back. What do you do? Say no again? So if you're God, you say, look, if you want to go, what's your journey now? When are you going to open your eyes? And that really is the journey of Akedah. Will you open your eyes to the truth? So Abraham's greatness is not just in his willingness to act on God's command, but lies in his willingness to see God's command for what it is. Do not lie to yourself about what you heard God say. Balaam's greatest evil here is that he is lying to himself. And I think we can all do that. When we hear a command like, the seventh day is a Sabbath, you shouldn't work on it. And that work includes, not earning a living, not doing your own pleasure, specifically meaning not working and not speaking a word of anger, according to the Septuagint. So if we're reasoning and saying, well, you know what, the seventh day is actually Sunday, so I'll work on the Sabbath, or what the Jews say is Sabbath. But you can't do that. You can't lie to yourself about the truth. You can try, but you make a big mistake. You really have to prove it for yourself and be honest about what the word says. So avoiding Balaam's greatest error. I'm going to just pause it here and look it over. To be honest, I don't fully agree with what they're trying to teach through this lesson of Balaam. I think they're really stretching it, in my opinion. But anyway, they said what they said, and they're basically saying, if you do what God tells you to do, you're Abraham. But if you are not humble and your ego is inflated, then you hear the message differently, and you're more like Balaam, that you insert yourself into God's words and you lie to yourself about what you hear. Okay, so Parashat Balak 2, they're going to look at the story of Balak, king of Moab. So why is the story of Balak in the Bible? Yeah, why is it there? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to skip that section, and there's a lot of Hebrew here. Yeah, I'm going to skip over that too. Basically says biblical connections to Balak's story. Balak, sorry. Um, Balak was a bad guy, but Pharaoh committed genocide. Cursing Israel is not the same thing as murder and slavery, but actually the Torah is making a deeper comparison, not about the actions of Pharaoh, but the intent behind their actions. Okay. Why did Balak want to curse Israel? Good question. I'm going to scan over this and give you the Reader's Digest version. All right, so the main concern, just like with Pharaoh, was that there are too many of them, the Israelites. And it's not just there are too many. It's one thing to have a lot of people, like say you have the immigrants coming into your country and they're just more than you are, but it's another thing when they're stronger than you. So not only are they more numerous than you, but they're also stronger than you. If you take them one-on-one, they will overpower you. And they were afraid of them because, a lot of people are just afraid of what they don't know. That's human nature. So there are many different motivations, but the size and strength of Israel, in terms of numbers, in terms of strength, obviously, really made Balak uh, afraid. So he wanted to do something about it, and that was to curse them. So the lesson behind Balak's story, okay. So how can I curse what God has not cursed? So their tactics are different. Um, they were trying to do the same thing though, maintain their power, live in the illusion of their own control. They were unwilling to become vulnerable by admitting that only God is really in control. God has to show them that I'm in control, not you. So Pharaoh, you won't see me at all. I'm going to bring these plagues on you until you have no choice but to see me. Balak, you know about me, but you think you can control me? I will put words of praise into Balaam's mouth instead of curses. You'll see who's in control. So the understanding the meaning of Balak's story. Okay, so the struggle, Israel's struggle with God was precisely what Balak's struggle is here. Israel knew God, but they didn't want to give up control to become vulnerable and exposed. So something changed in last week's Parsha. It says here, the new generation of Israelites begin to learn the message that their parents never did. They recognize God and give up control to Him. When they do, Israel's relationship with God is repaired. They are finally ready to assume the role as God's people. The people are now spiritually ready to pick up the mantle as the nation chosen by God to be the kingdom of priests, a people who models God's morality and values to the other nations of the world. And now that they have mended their relationship with God and accepted upon themselves the responsibility of the chosen nation, we jump right into the story of Balak, another nation. Will Moab look at Israel as a model of morality and godliness? Will other nations be able to learn from the chosen nation? Okay, so there's no enchanters or diviners in Israel. Israel doesn't try to manipulate God. They put their trust entirely in God's hands. So, okay, so they do trust God, but funnily enough, they only go so far as to this story. But as we find out later on, that Balak was able to get the children of Israel to sin. That's something he leaves out of the story. He leaves them to sin, obviously, with the women. That's human nature. It's hard to resist the allure of women. Parashat Pinchas. Okay, so talk about Phinehas. Okay. They were held up as a paradigm of godly people, the Israelites. So what happened? The sin of Baal Peor. Okay, so he actually does look at it. So never mind, I take back my statement. Talks about Israel committing harlotry with the daughters of Moab. And they caused Israel to sacrifice to their gods. They bowed down to their gods. They committed uh, basically fornication, not just adultery, but spiritual adultery, idolatry. So connections to Baal, Peor worship in the Bible. The Torah uses the term, whatever this is, they rose to mean sexual activity. For example, Rashi uses when Joseph was working for Potiphar in Egypt, Potiphar's wife tried to frame Joseph. She said, "Look, they brought us a Hebrew man to be with us. He came to lie with me." So that word seems to mean some sort of sexual promiscuity, just like Baal Peor. Both stories of idolatry seem to involve a worship, sacrifice, a feast, and the fundamental link between idolatry and sexual promiscuity. But that's not all. There's one more fascinating parallel. God was incredibly upset with the nation of Israel after the sin of the golden calf. And he gives them some new laws so that something like it would never happen again. So he gives them the law about that. Don't forge a covenant with other nation because you'll go astray after their gods. And you're gonna eat their offerings. You're gonna take their daughters for your sons and vice versa. And they'll pull you to their gods. Amazingly, the sin of Baal Peor is exactly what God is warning against after the Agel. I don't know what Agel means. Even look at the words in the Baal Peor story. Not only are the two sins related, the Agel seems to be warning against Baal Peor. There's clearly some sort of connection between these stories. Why does the Torah link Baal Peor with the golden calf? What do the connections to Baal Peor mean? We think the key to understanding their connection lies in one critical, subtle difference between the two stories. At the golden calf, idolatry led to promiscuity. At Baal Peor, promiscuity led to idolatry. The order is reversed. And that difference is critically important. Often when verses parallel one another, there'll be something you expect to line up perfectly, and the pieces just don't fit. For instance, in a chiasm, you have your A pasuk and your A, B, B, C, and instead of C, you get D. And our chiasm looks like this. This is called an inverted pair. Okay, Rabbi Foreman again. I remember this guy from a few newsletters ago. When something is listed twice in Torah, but listed in backwards order from one another, the Torah is trying to tell us that these two things you might think are different. They're actually the same thing. It isn't this, it's this. In our case is in a chiasm, where we would expect these two events, which are both about straying from God and worshiping a foreign deity, which share many of the same elements, to line up perfectly. Perhaps the Torah is telling us that they do. Instead of idolatry leading to promiscuity, or vice versa, the Torah is telling us that promiscuity and idolatry are both fundamentally expressions of the same thing. But what would that mean? The promiscuity and idolatry of Baal Peor, behind Baal Peor. At its core, sexual activity is a tool to build a real, deep, loving relationship. If I choose to be involved in sexual activity for the sake of physical pleasure above all else, I'm essentially taking that tool that was once used to build a relationship and using it not for love, but for momentary pleasure. And with that, I have to add selfish pleasure. And with that, I destroy the entire construct of intimacy. Sexual activity becomes a tool for pleasure and feeling, not love and depth. And now, idolatry. What is at the core of idolatry? An idolater takes worship, the very thing used to build a deep, loving relationship with God, and uses it outside the context of a real relationship with Him. As Rabbi Foreman explains in the video linked below, when it comes to polytheistic idolatry, worship is not about creating a deep relationship. It's about winning the gods over, to convince them to give you what you want. It's the opposite of creating a relationship. With idolatry, worship is just a tool for bribery and selfishness. That's a good point, actually. So promiscuity is taking sexual activity, which is meant to be a tool for a deep and loving relationship, and using it for selfish, superficial, I'm going to add temporary pleasure, like small picture pleasure. Idolatry is about taking worship, also a tool for a deep and loving relationship with God, and making the rituals meaningless for selfish purposes to curry favor from the gods. These are both ways of willingly destroying, or at least severely depreciating, the very concept of intimacy. At the heart of both of these things, it's not just selfishness, it's a lie that we tell ourselves. What is the meaning behind the heresy of Baal Peor? I'm going to just pause it for a moment. The adulterer, they deceive themselves into thinking that they can have their cake and eat it too. Sure, they'll also use these tools to build intimate relationships. I'm not denying that, but why can't they also separate them and just feel pleasure? Because when you remove the relationship part, you really do cheapen those tools, and you cheapen the concept of intimacy itself and relationships itself. That idea of sexual promiscuity and idolatry being one and the same perhaps explains something a bit odd. The plague ends when Pinchas takes a spear and impales two people involved in promiscuity. But if the sin of Baal Peor was the idolatry, why would stopping the sexual activity and the plague? Wouldn't it have made more sense for Phinehas to publicly impale someone worshipping Baal Peor? But it's the very same answer. The promiscuity and idolatry are two expressions of the same thing. Pinchas kills two people, literally, while they're misusing and devaluing the concept of sexual intimacy. In so doing, he redeems intimacy and preserves the potential for sexual intimacy to be used in a sacred relationship. The lesson hidden in the story of Baal Peor. Perhaps that's what the Torah wants us to learn from the parallels between the golden calf and Baal Peor. Regardless of which comes first, promiscuity or idolatry, one who engages in either shows a propensity to take a tool that's meant to create intimacy in a relationship and misuse it, devalue it. So the two really do go hand in hand. If someone violates one of them, the violation of the other could easily be right around the corner. And when God sees Pinchas act, he says, "You, Phinehas, you get it. Intimacy within Israel has been betrayed, with God and within the people." When Phinehas stands up to the promiscuity of a prince of the people, he's making a statement as representative of Israel and saying that we do not stand for those who betray our sacred relationships. Through this violent act, he somehow makes peace. So Look how God rewards him. I give him the covenant of peace. In fact, what do we call it when intimacy between a married couple is preserved, when the relationship is solid and loving? Shalom Bayit, a peaceful home. God gives Phinehas the covenant of peace, the kind of peace that is the symbol of a true, deep, intimate relationship. And isn't it interesting that the sins of the Egel and Baal Peor each happened right after a major turning point in the nation's relationship with God? The Egel happened after the revelation at Sinai, Baal Peor after the new generation of Israel finally recognizes and commits to God. Maybe they're there to teach us something profound. At first, Israel's struggle was to recognize and trust God, but once they do, it's not over. They have a new struggle. Can they maintain that relationship? Keep it sacred, intimate? That's a struggle we can all relate to. We're all in relationships. How often do we take them for granted? We assume that once we've established the relationship, we've done the work. At that point, it'll take care of itself. But the stories of Hegel and Baal Peor teach us the danger of that mindset. Intimacy and commitment can become dry, with God, with each other. In these stories, the Torah teaches us to take the tools of intimacy and relationship building and keep them sacred. Don't misuse these tools by taking them outside the context of a relationship. Realize their potential so that they'll be able to build our relationships stronger and stronger. So, for example, I guess you could say, when someone takes sex and they use that outside of marriage, out of that context, they cheapen it. They cheapen not just marriage, but intimacy itself and the act as well. In our newsletter about the menorah, we began explaining what it was like to have Yehovah's face shine down upon us. A number of weeks ago, we talked to you about Aaronic blessing. How it was a guide to parenting? Yes, it was from Rabbi Foreman as well. I'm not going to explain it here again, but I'd like you to go and read it as all of this is coming together in the newsletter. Even last week, the Shabbat service we had in which Sambra Wilson taught on healing. That and the midrash we had after. I do recommend you all come to services, that's the Zoom ones, and listen to the discussion about each week's lesson. They're quite informative. Anyway, it was during that session that it was said many times that Yehovah and these discussions are drawing us closer in an intimate relationship. We're getting to know each other and our weaknesses and our strengths. We showed you in that teaching how this blessing was like Yehovah, who guarded us in the beginning and then nurtured us, and then stepped back and let us be who we are. The last part of his teaching was in relation to the Sabbath and Yehovah looking at us eye to eye. Yehovah lifting his face to look at us directly, not down upon us. We then concluded the newsletter with the following. When our bridegroom comes and opens the door to let us into the wedding, he's going to say to 5 of those virgins, I never knew you, and it will be because they did not keep the commandments. Now, do you understand what we were saying in the Amida when we say B'Shem Shalom? With the light of his face, he gave us the Torah. Proverbs 6, verses 20 to 23. The commandments and the Torah are light. Isaiah 60, verses 2 and 3. The menorah, the tree of life, represents the light of Yehovah shining on us when we keep the commandments, which are the essence of who Yehovah is. And we keep them. We become like him. Then our lights will also shine. Are you able to understand what you have just been taught and what is going on around you and how it relates to our days right now? Isaiah 12, verse 2. The word translated as salvation is the Hebrew word Yeshua. Hebrew Strong's 3444, which means salvation by God. Isaiah 41, actually just excerpts from Isaiah and Hosea. So knowing all of this, then who are we talking about in Zechariah 9, verse 9? Today, just as we are about to enter the seventh millennium and the promised land, Baal Peor rules. The alphabet soup writes, dominate the news. I'm not going to say this because I want to get banned. Israel has once again become entangled in Baal Peor lifestyles. It is on our TV and just about everything you can turn on. The COVID-19 pandemic is taking hundreds of thousands of lives around the world, just as thousands of Israel died after the death of the Simeonite prince. Numbers 25:9. Is our worship with Yehovah, as we have been talking about, becoming dull? Is our intimacy with him taken over by other things, other distractions? What I am pointing out here is for each one of us to check our love for Yehovah. Has it become routine? Or are you just having sex for your selfish pleasure, Baal Peor? Or are you developing a close and open relationship with our Father, with your husband, Yehovah? Do you get through the prayers to check that off your list of things to do? Or are you talking to him like you do with your mother when she calls? You're about to witness millions of people die around the world in the next few years. Millions. How intimate are you going to be with Yehovah about everything? When is your prayer life going to get real? Are you at the stage in your life when Balaam can't curse you because you're righteous in Yehovah's eyes? It was Yehovah who died on the tree to pay the penalty that you should have paid. He loved you that much. He did not send someone else to pay for it. He paid for it with his own life. Satan is coming to deceive the whole world and, if possible, the elect as well. Maybe some of you. The Jesus in the world today accepts homosexual priests and lifestyles in his church. He is good with the laws being done away and with you worshiping him for doing so. This is Baal Peor and the golden calf. Yehovah is the Aleph Tav. He is the salvation, the Yeshua that we seek. He never changed and is the same today, yesterday, and forever. It is time to get intimate with Yehovah and seek his face and let his face shine down on us. When we begin to obey him and uphold the laws he has instituted for the kingdom. And I just want to add that it is a challenge to keep that relationship real and on fire because, for one, we are physical flesh and blood creatures, and Yehovah is a spirit being. So a lot of people tend to lean towards the sensual. They want something they can see, touch, hear, and all those things. However, when you really listen to his voice, you understand that it is heard by reading his words. It is felt when you remember all the things he's done for you, being thankful for what he's given to you in the past and gives us today, and the promises he's made for us in the future. And one thing I want to add, just to finish off, is that we need to remember that God created emotions, not so that we could be weak or be perceived as weak, but to make us stronger with him. Because I really do believe that just having an external ritual religion without an internal emotional reality of what is based on the truth of his holy words is really empty religion. I mean, just believing something and not doing it is empty. But I also think a third dimension is being emotional about it, to be emotionally intimate with our Father, not just spending the time, and that's important, don't get me wrong, to pray X amount of times a day, 3 times or 7 times, or an hour a day or 2 hours a day, reading, studying His Word, meditating on it, speaking the words, practicing and living them, but to have an emotional attachment with Him, the same way we do our best friends, our family members, our pets, something we really adore and admire and couldn't see ourselves living without. Because I do believe that just as He is the inventor and the creator of emotions, He is a very emotional uh, being as well. If He wasn't, think of it, if He was not an emotional being, He wouldn't have died for us on the cross. Because His love for us, that emotional content and quality, is greater than we could ever know or imagine. But it is manifest in that sacrifice that is so great that even though we were enemies in His sight, He died for us so that we could be reconciled to Him and no longer be enemies, but His own children. Okay, that's all I have to say about that. I'm going to go through the comments, and if there's anything significant, I'll mention it. Okay, so there's one comment about the identity of Yehovah. Is Yehovah the Father that he's alluding to here that died on the cross? Yeah, so that's what Joseph is saying. He is that Yehoshua is the Father. They're the one and the same. Personally, I believe Yehovah. When we say Yehovah, we mean both the Father and the Son. That's like their family name. They are one and united in purpose, just like a husband and a wife are one body. So are they one body, but just as husband and wife are two separate entities, they're not the same individual. Neither are the Father and the Son the same. Otherwise, a lot of the things that Yehoshua would say uh, sound like he's talking to himself. For example, when the voice came from heaven, said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." How would he be talking to himself? Do you see what I mean? So there's a lot of different things like that too. When Yehoshua was in the Garden of Gethsemane saying to his Father, please remove this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done. So who's he talking to? Is he talking to himself? Because that's just so, uh, it is not becoming of someone who is not only wise, but all-knowing and has the spirit of Elohim. So that's all I have to say about that. Again, I respect Joseph for his belief this that they're the same. Personally, yeah, they are the same in purpose, that they are echad, they are one, but I don't believe they're the same entity. But anyone who does believe, that Jesus Christ and the Father are one, I respect that. I'm not going to argue and debate with them, try to prove them wrong, because that's what they believe, and I believe what I do, and I respect that, and I hope they respect me as well. But I can see how it can be very controversial and divisive. So I'm not trying to start a debate about that, but that's just something that people have different understanding on, and I'm sure when the time comes, at the right time, our Father will make it known to all of us, and there will be no more disputes about it. There will be no question about it anymore. But that's for Him to reveal. And but what are we expected to do is to obey Him, to love Him, and love each other. So as long as we do those things, the nature of God is not something so simple to comprehend. So I can't say that I have all of it and I have it figured out. Neither can those who believe, the Father and the Son are one, can say they figured it out either. To say so and to be so bold to make that claim is, I think, a big mistake. it's better to just be humble and say, I could be right, but I could be wrong, but let God be right. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for your time. This was the newsletter from sightedmoon.com. We're going to look at the next one very shortly. I might record that tomorrow. So thank you again, and shalom.